Hello to all of you misfits who are tuning into this episode of the Introverted Misfit podcast. If you've clicked on this podcast episode, I'm guessing growing up as a child and as a teenager, you weren't quite black enough for the black kids, but you also weren't white enough for the white kids either. And to add insult to injury, you are on the autism spectrum, which is quite a dangerous combination, if you ask me. In just a few days from the time that I am releasing this podcast episode and you're listening to it, I will be attending the annual Autism in Black conference for 2025, which focuses on the unique experiences of Black autistic kids and adults. And I'm really excited, especially since it's not often that I get the opportunity to meet some fellow Black autistic people all in one place. So I actually thought that it would be fitting for this week's podcast episode to focus solely on life at the intersection of autism and Blackness, or something that I call weird Black kid syndrome. Being autistic and Black, or really any racial or cultural minority for that matter, is truly a unique experience that most people will never understand. Unique does not necessarily mean the experiences and struggles are worse or more important than any other struggle out there, as you'll see when we discuss the role of privilege in this conversation, but it just means different, unique. Therefore, it requires a unique set of tools and support to fight your way through and come out on the other side with your self-esteem and self-confidence intact. Weird Black kid syndrome, as I've decided to call this phenomenon, is the collective experience and aftermath of feeling culturally estranged from your Black peers, but also not being fully accepted by your non-Black, mostly white peers, with the added struggle of being autistic. When I say culturally estranged, I mean, according to Google, culturally estranged means that you are accustomed to different values, norms, and practices that differ from your cultures. In this case, Black American culture. In simpler terms, weird Black kid syndrome is what happens when you grew up not being Black enough for the Black kids, not being white enough for the white kids, and you're autistic, so you're not human enough, for a lack of a better term. Like you don't behave like a quote unquote normal human or normal person. To be fair, this weird Black kid syndrome is something that many non-autistic Black kids can relate to as well, as we'll discuss. But in the context of this conversation, being autistic on top of all of that is another level of feeling like an outcast or a misfit. It's also important to note that this syndrome may look different for different people depending on your gender, your socioeconomic status, the level of support that you had from your home life, and of course, the level of autistic spectrum disorder that you have. But I'm almost positive that you will be able to relate to at least some of the topics discussed in this episode. So let's get started. I want to start off this discussion by clarifying what I mean by this word weird. What does it mean to be weird, specifically if you are Black and autistic? Well, many autistic people, including ones who are not Black, know the experience of being considered weird by their non-autistic peers. When you take race out of it, weird is typically used to describe those autistic behaviors that aren't normal to autistic people. Now, autism does not look the same for everybody, especially when you talk about the level of support that different people need. But here's what I mean by autistic behaviors collectively. The way that we talk, whether it's a very monotone voice or a very exaggerated way of expressing ourselves or being nonverbal for that matter. Our mannerisms, whether it's the lack of eye contact, the quote unquote weird involuntary facial expressions or lack of facial expressions, the flat effect, the hand and arm and body movements, the pacing back and forth, things like that. our literal interpretation of things like jokes and sarcasm that make it really hard to fit in socially. Although I must say, I think I'm getting better at that. And really, any other behavior that may classify or be classified as not normal. It's weird to them. But when it comes to Black American culture, however, that word weird has some deeper layers underneath it than what I just described. Weird describes anything that is not popular in prevailing Black American culture. So before I can expound on what that prevailing culture is and what would be considered weird within it, I have to introduce this role of socioeconomic status or class structures into this discussion. So, with most groups of people, whether it's racial groups or cultural groups, like the big melting pot that America is, there is some sort of socioeconomic scale on which people lie. So, there are middle class people, upper middle class people, lower middle class, really wealthy people, which is like that top 1% of people that can apparently afford to fly themselves to Mars. And then there are people who are on the lower end of this socioeconomic scale. Now, just based on these different classes, there are stark differences between the class groups. You will find a completely different culture of music, language, experiences, jokes, hobbies, leisure activities, family dynamics, etc., that emerge out of these different class groups. So, an example would be those upper middle class or wealthy white people who like to go golfing every weekend and who are members of the country club and like to take their family to their second and third vacation home on the beach or in the mountains or something like that. I don't really know what rich people do in in their free time. So I'm kind of going off of stereotypes that I've heard. Um, versus say lower middle class people who probably couldn't afford to do those things. So the activities that they do are going to be different. Their vacations are going to look a little more modest and affordable, as are the clothes that they buy and the cars that they buy. Of course, I shamelessly shop on the clearance rack at Dillard's all the time. So, but in the Black community, these class differences are much more pronounced because of the higher levels of inequality that still exist in Black America, much of which has existed for centuries, as most of us are well aware. We are still very much overrepresented in lower income working class America, along with Hispanics and other minorities like American Indian and Alaska Native people. So when I talk about the cultural differences between the class groups, specifically in the Black community, it is very stark because of our overrepresentation in this class. The entertainment that we consume is different because it's meant to speak to different experiences. The music we listen to, well, music is kind of funny because the lines can sometimes be blurred with music. Rap and hip hop is really popular with a lot of different people. So, a funny side story, I was walking to my car from a doctor's appointment this one time, and I live in a mostly white city. It's middle class. And I saw these white teenagers driving a golf cart, and they were blasting this rap music that was talking about life in the streets and the ghetto and stuff. And I was just sitting there thinking to myself, what what do they know about this? Just like as they're driving this golf cart up and down the streets of this upper middle class neighborhood. I just thought that was so funny. But anyway, you get the gist. The music is different. The language and the way that we speak is different. There's such a thing as African American Vernacular English or AAVE. The clothes that we wear, the fashion sense, even the way that we were raised and conditioned to view relationships. The family structure is vastly different between the classes. So at the time that I'm recording this episode in 2025, family structure and fatherless homes is still a huge issue that we have been dealing with in the Black community really since the 1960s. And honestly, this concept is it's beginning to spread to other races in America, which is unfortunate, but that's whole nother whole nother topic for another episode. I'm not going to delve into that. And the negative effects of this inequality also show up a lot in academics, including grades, reading levels, and things like that, statewide test scores, and all that, which would logically disproportionately affect minorities because we make up a higher percentage of the lower income population. So, what does all of this have to do? All of this talk about inequality and class structures, what does that have to do with this word weird? Well, remember when I said that the word weird describes anything that is not popular in prevailing Black American culture? Well, in this said prevailing Black culture that seems to align with the lower socioeconomic experience, you will get called weird for deviating from that said culture. If you don't talk like them, you quote unquote sound white. If you don't dress like them or act like them or listen to the same music as them, you act white. If you do well in school, if you like to read and write and do anything nerdy, you act white. As if being smart is something that only white people are allowed to do, but I digress. If you come from a two-parent household, or if you want to get married and create a two-parent household, you are acting white. Basically, if you do anything that is perceived as characteristic of white people that goes against this subculture of Black America, you are not Black enough. You're weird. That's that extra layer of being weird that exists in Black culture. And of course, if you include the social and communication difficulties that autistic people exhibit, in addition to all of the cultural aspects, it really just amplifies that experience of being an outcast. And before we continue on to the rest of this discussion, I do want to take a moment here to acknowledge the level of privilege that my experience entails, because I am one of those Black kids who comes from a very supportive middle class family, both parents in the house, and I am also a low support needs autistic person, both of which I know allow me to thrive in ways that other Black autistic kids may not have had growing up. And again, there are so many more Black autistic experiences that are different from mine, different from the one that I'm mainly describing here. So, for instance, there are Black autistic people who grew up in what would be considered the predominant Black experience and culture. So they weren't culturally estranged. They fit in with Black kids culturally, but the autism makes it difficult for them to fit in socially. So there's a lot of nuances here. Okay, so now I've gone over the cultural estrangement aspect of not fitting in with Black kids. Now I want to move on to a different beast entirely. Fitting into white spaces, or really non-Black spaces, but mostly white. When you are navigating white spaces as an autistic Black person, especially if you're one of the only ones there, the meaning of this word weird has a slightly different meaning than it does in Black spaces. Because in this environment, the idea of acting white is obviously not going to be something that you get shunned for because they're all white. But the experience can still be just as ostracizing, just in different ways. So, the autistic behaviors described earlier in this episode make it difficult to make friends, engage in conversations with people, pick up on social cues, learn in a typical school setting, and just socialize in general. But on top of that, you stick out like a sore thumb because you don't look like the white kids. You felt like an imposter among them because your darker skin complexion was so different than theirs. Your kinky, coily hair texture that was always in plaits or braids or maybe an afro puff, it wasn't as free flowing as their straight tresses of blonde and brunette hair. So, as someone who already didn't fit in anywhere else because of the autism and all the other stuff that we've talked about, these aspects of your Blackness just seem to be the cherry on top of everything else that made you a misfit. Now, in my experience, there were definitely a few notably mean white kids that would make very racist or at least racially charged jokes and tease me about my Black features. So I remember this one time I went on a band trip in high school to, I'm pretty sure it was San Antonio, Texas. It was somewhere in Texas. And we went to some rodeo show there because it was Texas, of course, where the cowboy or whatever you call him, the person who was doing the show, he had a whip and a lasso and he was doing all these cool tricks. And this one white guy who was sitting beside me, who, by the way, I had actually considered this guy a friend of mine before this happened, but he made a joke to his other white friends that while I was in front of them, so he made the joke in front of everybody. He said that he jokingly said that I should be out there in front of the whip, which was crazy to me that he even felt bold enough to say that. But of course, I had social anxiety then, so I didn't say anything. I just kind of sat there and internally cried about it. And then that same white guy who made that joke later on during the trip, he made fun of my hair in front of everyone too, while we were eating breakfast at a table. It was like 10 or 12 people at this one table. Basically, he was insinuating that my Afro puff made me look like a man. Um, and yeah, there were a few other notably mean white kids. I've got more stories I could tell, but I won't. But in addition to that, I would argue that the Black kids were also just as mean, if not meaner, and they would oftentimes make a bigger deal out of things like skin color and hair texture and Black features, especially the boys, in my experience. So that's where all this talk about texturism, colorism, and self-hate and all of those topics come in. But that's another topic for another episode. So, all throughout my school years, I just remember being super hyper focused on my Blackness because that's what made me so physically different. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I'm betting that you were in the same boat. And your self-esteem and your sense of self-worth probably took a big hit, just like mine did. I remember being the only Black kid in all of my swimming classes as a child, and there were always those few white girls that would make it a point to ask me about hair. You know, why does your hair do that when it's wet? Why does your hair look like that? Why is it in those braids? All that kind of stuff. And it's not that there was any malicious intent behind that question about the questions about my hair, but I think it was just the fact that they always noticed it and felt the need to point it out. It would just make me even more self-conscious about it. I remember being the only Black kid on my high school's tennis team. And it just seemed like every team that we played, every school that we traveled to, every tournament that we played in, I was the only Black kid out there with this cast of white sunscreen on my face and my arms and everywhere else that didn't blend into my skin very well. I remember going through my entire middle and high school years with what's called hair envy. So just wishing and even praying that my tightly coiled hair, which was apparently so difficult to manage, could look like the biracial girl's hair and the white girl's hair that I saw in my classes. I even got my first relaxer as a child, and I remember being really excited about it because I could finally do one of those cute, effortless, messy buns that all of the white girls in my class would wear. I would literally sit in front of my dad's laptop and search for messy bun tutorials or French braided hairstyles on YouTube for hours at a time, just trying to get my hair to do that. And then when I eventually grew my relaxer out because my hair had broken off significantly, I took another hit to my self-esteem because I had to go back to the cornrows and the Afro puff hairstyles in high school and college. And I had to hear all those comments from my white and Black peers about how I should go back to having straight hair because it looked so much better on me. Straight hair looked so much better on me. That's what they would say. So I just became really incredibly self-conscious about my hair, particularly in white spaces. So much so that I eventually just cut all of it off. I even shaved it off completely at one point. Like I was literally skin bald so that it wouldn't be such a focal point in work and in school. I also remember that dreadful feeling of having to go back to school after summer break because my skin was a few shades darker from being in the sun and on the beach, and I thought people would notice and point it out. And then there were the stereotypes, of course, that I was constantly aware of and trying not to perpetuate as I was navigating these white spaces. So I didn't want to say the wrong thing in the wrong way and get deemed the sassy, argumentative black girl and eventually woman because I just wanted to fit in. You know that saying, it was the nail in the coffin? Well, my autism was the coffin, and my blackness was the nail in that coffin regarding my status of being a misfit. It was just, they were just compounded experiences that just made for the perfect storm of low self-esteem and low self-worth and being really self-conscious. So the aftermath of this weird black kid syndrome was a particularly difficult battle to get through as an adult. Basically, everywhere I went, I felt like an imposter, an outsider. I felt like I was being judged no matter what I did. It was hard for me to find other Black people who I felt were similar to me, or at least who would accept me, even if I wasn't like them. And even though I was used to being in white spaces by the time that I was an adult, I still had this lingering belief about myself that I just didn't fit in with them, physically and psychologically. And I just felt like people didn't want to be my friend. Not to mention that all of those experiences contributed to an almost decade-long battle with social anxiety, for which I had to eventually receive counseling for. And I was almost referred to a psychiatrist to be medicated for that social anxiety. That's how bad it was. That's how bad it was. So this low self-esteem that I had, it was showing up everywhere. The way that I dressed, the way that I took care of myself, the way that I was afraid to speak up in those team meetings at work because I was convinced that everyone, all of my white colleagues, would just think that my ideas were stupid. The way that I would constantly avoid eye contact and run away from social interactions because I actually believed that no one would ever want to be my friend or take me on a date or just have a conversation with me. Now, maybe you didn't have social anxiety like I did, but it may have shown up in other ways and in other areas of your life. So maybe you constantly tried to make yourself fit in with just anyone or with a particular group of people who would accept you, even if you really weren't compatible with them or you didn't even share their values and morals. Maybe you became an expert chameleon who would change the way that you talked and behaved to match whoever you were around, which was way more difficult to do while also having to mask the autism. Maybe you just became a loner because being by yourself was better than constantly being rejected and ridiculed for who you are. So, how do you move forward from this depressing state? That is, if you haven't already managed to make it out of this pit of despair and low self worth. It's a little more complicated than what I think I can cover in this episode because, as I've said before, everyone is different and everyone has different needs. Everyone responds to things differently. But here is where that journey starts. It starts when you stop trying to fit in where you're not welcome. For a long time, you've convinced yourself that you have to change who you are at your core so that certain people will like you. You've been trying to act more black, whatever that means, so that you can fit within a subculture that just doesn't want you. You've been trying to overcompensate in white spaces by trying to copy every little thing they stereotypically do and how they look, just so that your differences will be less noticeable. So you're not just masking your autistic traits, You're trying to change who you are to be likable. The good news is you do not have to do that if you don't want to. And I'm betting you don't want to. It is possible to improve your social and communication skills as an autistic person without having to fake being someone that you're not. And it all stops when you stop trying to fit in with people that don't want you. Improve yourself to the best of your ability. So be the best version of yourself that you can be. Build some self-esteem and some self-worth, and fit in with people who accept you, who share your values and morals, and who are not superficial. And stop worrying so much about what race they are. If they happen to be Black like you, that's great. If they're white or Asian or otherwise, that's perfectly fine too. They're people. Just talk to people who actually want to talk to you and who are good people and who aren't going to ridicule you and toss you aside because you're a little bit awkward. When I tell you that now, after going through my self-confidence journey, I walk into a room full of white people with the same level of confidence that I walk into a room full of Black people with. It does not matter to me. I am no longer hyper focused on my race, what people may or may not be thinking about me, or anything like that. I'm just me. I walk with my head held high, natural kinky hair and everything, and I just talk to people who show me the same respect that I show them. Now, here's the other thing. If you are shy or socially anxious because of your social and communication differences, then you're never going to find that tribe of people that I'm talking about because you're too nervous to go places and attend events where you would actually meet these people. So if that sounds like you and you are more of an introvert, meaning that you need your alone time to decompress and you'd much rather talk to just one or a few people at a time instead of being in large gatherings like our more extroverted counterparts, I can help you with that. My one-on-one program, Communicate with Quiet Confidence, was specifically made to help introverts like yourself become socially confident in a way that feels natural to them. So you and I would work together to overcome your shyness and your social struggles so that you can build those fulfilling relationships with the people who are right for you. So check the link in the description to book your free connection call with me today so that we can talk about your goals and your struggles and whatever else. So that's it for today's episode about fighting through that unique and tough struggle of being at that intersection of Blackness and autism and just not feeling like you fit in anywhere. So again, this Friday through Sunday, I'll be in West Palm Beach for the annual Autism and Black conference. So if you'll be attending, definitely let me know in the comments. I'm getting really excited about this opportunity again because I don't think I've ever been in a place where I get to meet other Black autistic people of all shades, types, support needs. I've just never been around people like me, you know? So um I'm excited about the people that I'm going to meet, the connections I'm going to make. I'm excited about the conversations that I'm going to have, what type of insight I can bring back to all of you listening. I mean, of course, my listener base is not only Black people, but I'm sure there will be other topics that can be useful for um, autistic people and misfits like the ones who listen to this podcast episode, whether you're Black or whatever race you are. And maybe I'll get a chance to meet some autistic extroverts because I know you guys are out there. Probably not listening to this podcast, seeing as it's for introverts. But anyway, and of course, I'm excited to get a chance to visit the beach there if I can find time to do that, which I'm sure I will. But before I close out this episode, I would love it if you could share with me your unique experience of living at the intersection of Blackness and autism. Because as I stated earlier, Every Black person is not the same, and every autistic person is not the same. So our experiences are going to be different. So tell me about your experience in the comments, or you can contact me via the contact page of my website by going to theintrovertedmisfit.com/contact. I can't wait to hear about it. As always, if you enjoyed this talk, please don't forget to hit the follow or subscribe button. Leave a review and or a comment, whether you're tuning in on YouTube, Spotify Podcast, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts from, and share this podcast with a friend. Thanks for listening and have a great day.